rather than this whole Western notion of taking, we reorient our minds and our spirits and our behaviors toward giving and sharing. What kind of theologies do we begin to construct? I mean, will God forever remain the guarantor of the white male status quo? Or will we imagine another kind of deity? I argue that enslaved Africans in America looked toward heaven and saw something different from the slave master, who also looked toward heaven, by the way. The slave master would look toward heaven and say, thank you, God, for the plantation and all these darkies that you've given me to control. And the slave would say, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. It's just two different conceptions of one reality. Two different perspectives, right? And that of the slaves, you know, they began to envision a world where their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would be free and have the right of self-determination and the right to name their own reality, the right to organize their own dollars, the right to read and write. Right? They began to imagine a new reality. And because they were imagining it, they were able to put together the kinds of resources needed to live into it. And so I learned from my ancestors, really. And my ancestors have already done this work. And I think that they are now calling us in the 21st century to do the work again. And I don't imagine it's just my ancestors, by the way. I think others' ancestors are also calling. Your dream, your vision comes from somewhere. Amen. As does yours, Doc. And I'll quit right there.
Coming at this completely differently, let me give you a little bit of my biography because people assume they know my biography and they don't. I'm also an immigrant. I was born in Barbados. My family is British West Indian, which means neither the upper class nor the lower class. Because in the British West Indies, the church to which you belong is an indicator of your class in the general structure. So had I said my parents were Anglicans, that would have told you one thing. Had I told you my parents were Baptist or Pentecostals, that would have told you something else. That I've told you my parents were Methodists tells you that my parents come from an educated middle class, but not the upper class. Let me add to that narrative that I come from 3 generations of migrants on both sides of my family. So when you ask me, where are your people from, be prepared for a long answer. And the most recent laborers in my family are cane workers from India. My grandmother's people were imported by the British after they outlawed slavery in 1834 with William Wilberforce in Parliament, because the white planters weren't going to pick the sugar cane, and the black Jamaicans were in the majority. They weren't going to pick it either. And so they lied to my grandparents' people and said, come over here because you're in the lower castes, and we will do right by you. And thus came an entire generation of Indian laborers to Jamaica and Trinidad and Guyana. So I come from migrant laborers, as well as from the educated middle class. On one side of my family, I'm second generation PhD. On the other side of my family, my mother's first generation college. Then I come from the global South, which means that when we came to the United States, we did not have the money that we needed to clothe 5 people, 3 children under 10, with winter clothes. And we had to depend on the largesse of people, in this case, white people, to survive. And indeed did. And so I already came with a complicated understanding of family, right? Because my family was never black and white to begin with. I grew up in a majority culture, which was overwhelmingly Christian. Overwhelmingly Christian. I didn't know that there were non-Christians of any kind. And I didn't even realize the Rastafarians weren't Christians because I was a kid. And they wouldn't necessarily say they're not. Even that derives from and is a signification, to use Charles Long's work, on Christianity. I didn't even realize there were others until I moved to the United States, right? And I come from a land in which, the place in which I was born, grows sugarcane and has to import sugar. That is a Christian issue, right? It grows sugarcane and has to import sugar. It has an underwater aquifer and is looking at desalination plants because there is so much white northern tourism on which it depends to survive that it's beginning to drain the aquifers on which the people rely for water. And now I am implicated in the system that keeps the land on which I was born and the lands on which my parents were born impoverished. So I'm very much aware of the fact that I live in empire. And part of the reason that when I teach New Testament, one of the things I always stress is the issue of the Roman Empire. Is that if we cannot learn from those ancestors who are people of color. How many people here know that the people in the New Testament really were not all white people? But, you know, if we can't learn from those people of color what it is to respond to empire, and the ways in which they did it well, and the ways in which they did not do it well. Because, in fact, there are parts of the New Testament where they did not respond well to empire. And they responded in ways that they had to because they had no power, right? What does it mean to preach to African Americans who have to join the military in order to afford to go to seminary? We underline that. Who have to join the military in order to afford to go to seminary, about the role of the hired soldier in the Roman Empire. Right? And our implication as the people of color in the oppression of people of color who look just like us, just south of us. Right? The other thing I want to talk about as somebody who has migrated to this country, English is my first language, it always has been, is the way in which we have to deal with the fact that we are very xenophobic. Americans, I don't care what color y'all are xenophobic people. I'll tell you that right now. I have been on this campus with African students who have told me they never get invited into study groups. I've talked to Korean students who are first generation on other campuses who've told me the same thing. And African students on other campuses who have told me the same thing. This is not indicative of ITC. This is a system-wide issue. We are so afraid of the other that we can't hear them. We hear an accent and we just stop. And we don't listen to them. If we as people of color can't do that, how in the world do we expect the church to change? If we as people of color can't at least work within the places where we do agree, even though there may be places where we don't agree, how in the world do we expect the church to change? How do we expect to see an indication of the reigndom of God if we can't at least look at the ways in which we foster the same things and uphold the empire that is oppressing us? And how we, within our own, at the bottom of the hierarchy, are supporting the hierarchy.
I had the privilege of serving as the Korean Caucus's young adult representative to the Cross Caucus. Do any of you know what that is? Our denomination has a strange system of assigning us to caucuses of like-colored people, and then we don't know what to do with like African immigrants, or West Indians, or Middle Eastern people. Are they in the African American caucus or in the Middle Eastern caucus, or and it was a really, really absurd situation where the denomination was giving each of the 5 major caucuses, and the Koreans were like a kind of a quasi-independent caucus, about 22,000 a year, and then it got reduced to 18,000, then 14,000. There's hardly any money going to the caucuses, and instead of, this is in the early 2000s, instead of us speaking together at a common table about why are we part of this system, and are we really going to compete with each other for these crumbs, given to us, and well, we're the bigger caucus, so we should get a little bit more of that, and what is a system doing to our mentality and to our leadership and to our dignity and to our role in transforming this whole system for something that's more life-giving for everyone? So it seemed like mostly an exercise in absurdity, but sometimes we have to be in absurdity in order to change it. Just that's why God became human. But I also recognize that there's a kind of competition among oppressed peoples. There's a competition of victimization. And as a pastor, I've noticed that when we lack virtue, when we lack Christian character, we will latch on to victimization as our trump card. So if somehow I can convince myself that I'm a bigger victim of whatever it is, society, parents, oppression of any kind, than Mark, for instance, then I'm more virtuous than Mark. I mean, let's say that the 3 of us were held captive somewhere and we were all tortured, but I got 3 lashes and Margaret got 2 and Mark got 1. At the end of the day, I will feel like the greater victim, and I will feel more virtuous. I mean, it's weird how the human mind works. I could be the biggest jerk among the 3 of us, which, by the way, is clearly not the case. This is just an argument I'm making. But, but even if I were, you hear what I'm saying, if I get more lashes than them, I'm somehow going to come out at the end of the day feeling more virtuous. And I think among the oppressed peoples, we have a competition of victimization as a shortcut to virtue. And I think this is one of the reasons, and now I'm speaking as someone who's viewing, other groups, and that's why we're here at the table, so I can be corrected. But I see in the African American community wanting to cling to the title of greatest victimized in this country. And now the thing is that we can argue, and many of us can agree that that is empirically true. I mean, hundreds of years of the most oppressive kind of slavery. But is that the final word? And is that God's standard for leadership, for transformation, for reconciliation? Right? So there has to be deference paid to that. There has to be respect. There has to be compassion and honor given to suffering because of what it does to the human spirit. But instead of competing with each other on our victimized status, how do we invite people into a new narrative, a new framework out of which we understand that actually those who may be what we call the oppressors are sometimes the most victimized of all in some ways. In my church, I do more pastoral counseling with our white members than any other group in our church. And they are just regular run-of-the-mill white people of all ages. Typically, they have better paying jobs and a higher level of education and live in better homes than most of the other members of our church who are immigrants. But they are more brain damaged, than just about anybody else in our church. And I mean that, like Pavlov's dog, you ring the bell and it has him salivate. I mean, our white members have grown up in some seriously relationally deficient upbringing.